Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we are going to unpack one of the most fascinating, complex, and frankly visceral eras in modern sports history. We're looking at British football between the 1970s and the 1990s. This was a time when the beautiful game was completely overshadowed by a really grim reality on the terraces. It sparked massive media panics and ultimately resulted in some of the most heavy-handed legislation ever applied to sports fans. We're going to use our sources today to map out exactly how we got from raw terrorist violence to sweeping government crackdowns and what it all actually means for the culture of the game today. Now, listen to this quote, because it perfectly sets the stage for just how dire things had become. A slum sport played in slum stadiums and increasingly watched by slum people. That was an actual editorial printed in the Sunday Times back in 1985. It's a completely shocking quote, right? But it perfectly captures how the government, the press, and honestly, the general public viewed football at the time. It had basically become a social pariah. So, to understand how we reach such a staggering level of national disgust, we have to go on a journey. We'll look at the problem itself, the agitation of that problem, and the government's ultimate solution. And to understand that heavy legislation, we first need to look at the raw problem on the ground. Which brings us to Section 1, the hooligan era. Right, so in the 1970s, we start seeing the rise of organized groups of violent supporters. You've probably heard them called firms. Now, these weren't just fans getting overly passionate about a bad referee's call. Many of these groups actively sought out violent confrontations with rival supporters. They were literally arranging fights in train stations, city centers, and local pubs. It was like a weekend battleground. By the early 1980s, the violence had escalated dramatically. Flares, riots, and mounted police charging through crowds. That just became a regular weekend occurrence. And the result of all this chaos? Well, by the mid-1980s, English First Division attendance hit a post-World War II low. The game was absolutely terrifying decent folks away. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is if you search formal historical records for a notorious group like West Ham's inner city firm, you might actually come up empty. Yet they are absolute legends in subcultural lore and hooligan memoirs. These firms operated in the shadows, creating this dark reputation that spread like wildfire far beyond Britain. But it raises a really fascinating question. How much of this was a coordinated existential threat to society, and how much of it was amplified by the people watching them? And that leads us right into Section 2, media and moral panic. So, did the media create the hooligan or just report on him? In a seminal 1978 essay, renowned cultural theorist Stuart Hall took a completely different approach to this. While earlier studies, like the 1968 Harrington Report, tried to psychoanalyze the fans and treat hooliganism as some bizarre mental pathology, Hall shifted the academic focus away from the agents of violence and onto the agents of reporting. He actually started analyzing the journalists themselves. Hall argued that the press didn't just passively reflect what happened at football matches. No, they actively selected and presented isolated incidents to construct a much larger, disproportionate societal threat. The media regularly reduced these fans to terms like savages and animals. By taking isolated violent acts, grouping them together under a catchy label, and splashing them on the front pages, the press essentially created a sensationalist spiral. Now, Hall didn't deny the violence existed, of course not, but he pointed out that this moral panic amplified the problem far beyond the actual threat to the general public, the vast majority of whom had literally never directly experienced football hooliganism. But while sociologists and journalists debated the morals and representation of working-class youth, the physical environment of the sport was seriously deteriorating, leading to a tragic climax where the human stakes became devastatingly real. Let's move to Section 3. Tragedies on the terraces, and look at those human stakes. We absolutely have to strictly and impartially contrast two defining events of the 1980s, because they're so often confused in the timeline of football safety. First, in 1985, at the Heysel Stadium in Brussels, hooligan-driven violence by a section of English supporters led to a wall collapse. 39 people, mostly Juventus fans, tragically died. This directly resulted in English clubs being slapped with a ban from European competitions for 5 years. But 4 years later, in 1989, the Hillsborough disaster occurred. A severe crowd crush in overcrowded standing pens claimed 97 lives. Now, for years, early narratives wrongly blamed the supporters for this. However, extensive investigations definitively proved that Hillsborough was a fatal failure of crowd management, stadium safety, and policing. It was not hooliganism. This is a vital correction because it fundamentally shifted the national narrative from just controlling violent fans to protecting all supporters. 136. That is the combined human cost of just those two tragedies. 39 at Heysel, 97 at Hillsborough. That is just a staggering loss of life for a sporting event, and it left an indelible scar on the game. The sheer gravity of these events demanded action. The government could no longer just rely on the police to chase ferns out of local pubs. And this brings us to their ultimate bureaucratic solution. Here is Section 4, the 1989 legislative crackdown. The government's response juxtaposed the raw, visceral emotion of those stadium tragedies with cold, strict legal jargon in the Football Spectators Act of 1989. So the crucial point is to understand how heavy-handed this was. The act mandated the creation of the Football Licensing Authority to oversee stadium safety. It also proposed a highly controversial national membership scheme. The goal there? To restrict match attendance entirely to authorized registered spectators. The act also gave the Secretary of State the power to direct stadiums to implement strict seating conditions, and crucially, it made it a literal criminal offense to enter or remain on premises as a spectator without proper authorization. The act also aggressively targeted fans traveling abroad, desperately trying to prevent another Heysel. If a fan was convicted of a relevant offense, and honestly that could be anything from actual violence to just being drunk on a train to a match or even harassment, the court could issue a restriction order. What does that mean? It legally required the fan to report to a specific police station in England or Wales during a designated football match being played outside the country. It was basically a physical tracking system. Exemptions were incredibly hard to get and granted only under special circumstances by an enforcing authority. The law was quite literally attempting to physically anchor individuals to prevent international violence. These sweeping legislative changes, combined with massive inquiries like the Taylor Report that followed Hillsborough, completely reshaped the physical and cultural environment of the sport. Which brings us to our final section, Section 5, Modernizing the Beautiful Game. And this brilliantly illustrates the stark contrast between the two eras. The 80s were defined by overcrowded standing pens, chain-link fences, riots, and just a constant lingering fear for anyone attending. Fast forward to today, following all those reforms, and we have all-seater stadiums, advanced CCTV, electronic ticketing, and heavily surveilled, family-friendly environments. The violence of the 70s and 80s has been largely expelled from the top divisions, completely rebuilding the sport's global image. But as we wrap up this explainer today, I want to leave you with a provocative thought. It's one raised by sociologists like Ian Taylor. He argued that the old football subculture, aggressive as it was deeply, deeply rooted in working-class communities. As the big money flowed in and the all-seater, highly priced, hyper-surveilled stadiums took over, many working-class boys felt like they were losing their football. We successfully removed the violence from the terraces, and we absolutely saved countless lives in doing so. But we really must ask, at what cost to the culture of the game? Did we achieve absolute safety through social exclusion? It's a complex trade-off that still defines the soul of modern football today. Thank you so much for joining me to unpack this, and always remember to keep questioning the history behind the headlines.